Hey you, grab me another bourbon. And tell whoever's flying this thing to stop hitting the bumps. The words sliced through the cabin of the Gulfstream G700 like a thrown glass, sharp and entitled, and loud enough to make the two other men in the leather seats across the aisle stop talking mid-sentence. Richard Calloway, the chief executive of Calloway Holdings, did not even look up from his phone as he said it. He simply waved a thick hand in the general direction of the woman walking down the aisle, snapped his fingers twice the way a man snaps his fingers at a dog he has not yet bothered to train, and went back to scrolling through a quarterly earnings report he did not actually understand. His target was a woman in a crisp navy uniform with 4 gold bars on each shoulder, a peaked cap tucked under her left arm, and a clipboard pressed to her chest containing the pre-flight checklist she had just personally completed in the cockpit of the very aircraft Richard Calloway had spent 22 minutes complaining about. Her name was Captain Amara Hayes. She was 36 years old, a former United States Air Force flight officer with 2,400 logged hours on multi-engine jets, and she was the pilot in command of the private aircraft currently flying Richard Calloway and his 2 business partners from Teterboro to a closed-door acquisition meeting in Dallas that would, if it closed, make Richard the largest single shareholder of a regional bank he had been quietly trying to corner for 9 months. Richard had just demanded that the captain of his aircraft fetch him a drink. He had used the word sweetheart in front of his chief financial officer and his lead acquisitions attorney. He had snapped his fingers at her, and he had done all of this approximately 14 seconds after she had stepped out of the cockpit in full uniform, gold wings glinting on her left breast pocket, to introduce herself to the cabin and walk through the safety briefing she was federally required to deliver before takeoff. What Richard Calloway did not know, what he could not possibly have known as he gestured dismissively at the woman whose hands were about to hold his life at 39,000 feet, was that within 72 hours, the Federal Aviation Administration would receive a formal complaint that would unravel his entire transportation contract. He did not know that the woman he had just called sweetheart had been recruited personally by the chairman of his own board 6 months earlier to evaluate the executive flight operations of Calloway Holdings from the inside. He did not know that the small recorder clipped discreetly to her uniform lapel, the one he had mistaken for a microphone for the intercom, was running. And he did not know, could not know, that the calm woman now lowering her clipboard and turning to face him with a small measured smile was about to dismantle a quiet pattern of executive misconduct that had been protected for 15 years. Before we step into one of the most unforgettable moments of corporate accountability to ever play out at 39,000 feet, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments below. We genuinely love reading them, and the range of places that scroll past after a story like this one is something we never take for granted. And if the opening already has you leaning forward, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on those notifications. Stories about quiet competence finally meeting loud entitlement. Stories about women who refuse to be reduced to the role someone else decided they should fill. Those stories deserve to travel. Now let us rewind. Let us go back to the morning of that flight, 12 hours before Richard Calloway snapped his fingers at a captain in full uniform and assumed she would obey. Because to understand what happened in that cabin, you have to understand who Amara Hayes actually was and what Richard Calloway had already been doing on private aircraft for years without ever once being held accountable. The morning sun had just begun to spill across the tarmac of Teterboro Airport when Amara pulled her practical dark sedan into the executive flight crew lot and stepped out into the cool October air. She liked arriving early. It was a habit she had developed during her 7 years in the Air Force, refined during her 3 years flying for a regional cargo carrier in the Pacific Northwest, and now a habit that gave her an unhurried 90 minutes to walk the aircraft, review the weather along the route, check the manifests, and meet quietly with her first officer before any passenger ever set foot on board. The silence of an empty hangar at sunrise was, in her opinion, the most honest place a pilot could begin a day. The silence was where the real work happened, the slow, methodical work of making sure that nothing she could control would be the thing that killed anyone. To anyone watching her walk across that tarmac, dark braids gathered into a low, neat coil at the base of her neck, the gold wings on her uniform catching the early light, a flight bag in one hand and a thermos of black coffee in the other. She looked like exactly what 15 years of disciplined work had made her. A senior captain at the top of her field. A woman who had earned every stripe on her shoulder twice over because the world had quietly demanded that she earn them twice. What she did not look like, in Richard Calloway's mental hierarchy, was a pilot. In Richard's mental hierarchy, pilots had silver hair and a forearm tan and a flight school in Florida, and a story about their father who had flown F-4s over Vietnam. Pilots looked like Richard's college roommate. Pilots did not look like Amara Hayes. This was not a guess on Amara's part. This was documented. She had read the reports. 6 months earlier, on a rainy Thursday afternoon in late spring, Amara had been sitting in a quiet conference room on the 42nd floor of a midtown Manhattan office building, drinking a cup of perfectly average coffee and listening to a man named Walter Brennan explain to her exactly what he wanted her to do. Walter was 71 years old, the founding chairman of the board of Calloway Holdings, and the original investor who had given Richard Calloway his first $8 million of seed capital 15 years earlier, when Richard had been a hungry, talented, relatively humble young executive with a real eye for distressed assets. Walter had watched Richard grow that $8 million into a portfolio worth just over $2.5 billion. He had also watched something else happen across those same 15 years, something he had been trying for the past 3 years to confirm without success, because every internal investigation he had quietly commissioned had been quietly buried by an HR department that reported directly to Richard. Walter had a folder on the table between them. The folder contained 17 pages of complaints filed by former flight attendants, charter pilots, hotel staff, and one private chef over a period of 11 years, all of them nomming Richard Calloway, all of them describing a consistent pattern of demeaning, predatory, and occasionally physically intimidating behavior on or adjacent to private aircraft. All of them settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements funded out of a discretionary account that did not appear on any board-facing financial document. Walter slid the folder across the table to Amara. He told her he had not been able to bring any of it to the full board because every complainant had signed away their right to testify, and because Richard's personal attorneys had structured the settlements in a way that made the underlying conduct legally invisible. He told her that what he needed was someone new, someone unconnected to any of the previous incidents, someone whose own credibility was unimpeachable, whose flight record was spotless, whose military service was decorated, and who would be willing to fly Richard Calloway as captain of his executive aircraft for a defined evaluation period of 6 months while quietly documenting every interaction. Walter told her the assignment would be uncomfortable. He told her Richard would almost certainly behave in front of her exactly the way he had behaved in front of 17 other women, because Richard had never once in 15 years adjusted his behavior in response to a woman's professional credentials. He told her that her own salary would be paid through the board's independent oversight committee, not through Calloway Holdings, so that her employment could not be terminated by Richard or by anyone reporting to him. He told her that if at any point during the 6 months she felt unsafe, she was authorized to ground the aircraft immediately, no explanation required. And he told her, leaning forward across the table with the slow, careful tone of a man who had thought about every word of this conversation for several weeks, that what he wanted at the end of those 6 months was not a lawsuit, and not a press leak, and not a viral video. What he wanted was a clean, documented, legally airtight body of evidence that could be presented to the full board of directors in a formal session, in person, with Richard in the room, in a way that would make removal a formality rather than a fight. Amara had read the folder twice. She had asked 4 questions. She had thought about the assignment for 48 hours. And then on a Saturday morning, sitting at her kitchen table in her small apartment in Queens with a cup of coffee and her grandmother's old leather-bound notebook open in front of her, she had called Walter back and said yes. She had said yes for several reasons. She had said yes because the money was good. She had said yes because the evidence in the folder had made her quietly furious in a way she had not felt in many years. but mostly she had said yes, because she had recognized something in one of the 17 complaints. The complaint had been filed 9 years earlier by a young flight attendant named Janelle Robinson. Janelle had been 24 at the time, 3 months into her first job after culinary school, working a charter route between Teterboro and Aspen on an aircraft Richard Calloway had leased for a long weekend with 3 of his business partners. The complaint described, in the careful clinical language of a woman who had clearly written and rewritten it several times before filing, a series of incidents that had occurred over the course of that weekend, culminating in Richard cornering Janelle in the galley of the aircraft on the return flight and telling her, with his hand on the small of her back, that her continued employment with the charter company depended entirely on whether she could learn to be friendlier with the men who paid for the seats. Janelle had filed the complaint with her employer the following Monday. She had been quietly terminated within 2 weeks. She had received a settlement of $41,000 in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement so broad that she had not been able to discuss the incident even with her own therapist without technically violating its terms. Janelle Robinson was Amara Hayes' cousin. They had grown up 2 blocks apart in southeast Queens. They had spent every Christmas of their childhood at the same kitchen table, eating their grandmother's macaroni and cheese. Janelle had stopped flying after the settlement. She had moved home, taken a job at a bakery in Jamaica, Queens, and had told Amara only that she had decided private aviation was not for her. She had never once in 9 years mentioned Richard Calloway's name. Amara had read the name in Walter's folder, had read the description of the incident, had read the date and the route and the aircraft tail number, and had sat very still for a long minute in that midtown conference room before she had asked her first question. Walter had not known about the family connection. He had selected Amara for entirely independent reasons, a coincidence that Amara would later describe to her therapist as the kind of coincidence that did not feel like a coincidence at all. She had not told Walter. She had not told Janelle. She had simply said yes, signed the contract, and begun preparing for what was, in her own private accounting, the most important 6 months of her professional life. That had been 6 months ago. In the month since, Amara had flown Richard Calloway on 11 separate trips. She had watched him speak to 2 female flight attendants in tones that ranged from condescending to openly demeaning. She had watched him make a comment about the legs of a hotel concierge in Dallas that had caused the concierge to leave the conversation in tears. She had watched him, on one memorable flight back from Miami, attempt to convince a junior associate at his firm that she would have a much easier career trajectory if she learned to laugh more readily at his jokes. Amara had documented every incident in a leather-bound logbook she kept in the locked compartment of her flight bag. She had cross-referenced every entry with the recordings from the small audio device clipped to her uniform. She had transmitted weekly encrypted summaries to Walter's private legal counsel. She had said nothing to Richard. She had said nothing to the first officer. She had simply flown the aircraft, smoothly and professionally and without a single deviation from procedure, and she had waited. What Amara had been waiting for, what Walter and his legal counsel had been waiting for, was the single specific incident that would close the legal case beyond any possible counterargument. The previous incidents, individually documented, were damning but defensible. Richard's attorneys, the same attorneys who had buried 17 prior complaints, would argue context, argue tone, argue that no individual exchange rose to the level of terminable conduct. What Walter needed was a moment in which Richard's behavior crossed a line that no attorney could spin, in front of witnesses whose credibility Richard himself could not impeach, because they were his own business partners, on an aircraft where federal aviation law granted Amara, as captain, an authority that superseded every corporate hierarchy Richard had ever exploited. Walter had told her, in their final preparation meeting 2 weeks before this trip, that the moment would come. He had told her she would know it when it arrived. He had told her not to provoke it, not to invite it, not to engineer it in any way. He had told her only to be patient, to be professional, and to be ready. The moment, as it turned out, had arrived 23 seconds into the safety briefing. now walking across the tarmac in the cool October air with the gold wings catching the morning light. Amara took a long, slow breath. She had been ready for 90 minutes for 6 months. The aircraft was already waiting at the executive terminal, a Gulfstream G700 in pristine white, with the small navy chevron of Callaway Holdings painted just below the cockpit window. Amara walked around it twice. This was not strictly required. Her first officer, a steady 48-year-old former Navy aviator named Daniel Hayes, had already completed the formal walk-around 30 minutes earlier and had signed off on every required item. Amara walked it again anyway. She always walked it again. She ran her hand along the leading edge of the left wing the way her first flight instructor had taught her to do 19 years earlier, looking for the small imperfections that no checklist could quite capture. The kind of imperfections that revealed themselves only to the hand of a pilot who had decided that this particular aircraft, on this particular morning, was her responsibility. She climbed the air stair and stepped into the cabin. The aircraft was empty. The cabin attendant, a quiet young man named Mateo who had worked the Callaway routes for 2 years and who had quietly become one of Amara's closest allies in the documentation process, was arranging glassware in the forward galley. He looked up when she entered, gave her a small professional nod, and then, after glancing once toward the open cabin door to confirm no one was within earshot, said softly, "He brought Sterling and Greaves today." "The full team." "He's in a mood," Amara nodded. Sterling was Callaway Holdings' chief financial officer, a careful, precise man named Jonathan Sterling who had been with the company for 11 years, and who, by Walter's quiet assessment, was the single most likely board ally if the case ever moved to a formal vote. Greaves was the lead acquisitions attorney, a younger, sharper man named David Greaves whose loyalty to Richard was personal rather than institutional. Greaves had been with the company for 4 years. Greaves would not, in Walter's assessment, defend Richard once the recordings were played. Amara walked forward, opened the cockpit door, and slid into the left seat. Daniel was already running through the avionics checks. He glanced at her, registered the small tightness around her eyes that he had learned in the past 6 months to recognize, and said only, "You good?" She said, "I'm good." He nodded once. He did not know the full scope of what she had been documenting. He knew only that there were extra protocols in place for this particular client, that the cabin recording systems were active for legal compliance reasons, and that Amara was authorized to make decisions on this aircraft that no other captain in his career had ever been authorized to make. He had not asked questions. Daniel Hayes was the kind of first officer who understood that some questions were not his to ask. He simply flew the aircraft. The passengers arrived at 8:53. Amara heard the cars pull up on the tarmac through the open cockpit window, heard the slam of 3 doors, heard Richard's laugh before she heard his voice, the particular braying laugh that he produced when he was about to tell a story he had already told 4 times in front of the same audience. She listened as the 3 men climbed the air stair, as Mateo greeted them at the cabin door, as Richard responded to Mateo's professional welcome with a comment about the temperature of the cabin that managed to be both rude and somehow also irrelevant. She heard Sterling say, "Good morning, Mateo." She heard Greaves say nothing at all. She heard the 3 men settle into the leather seats in the main cabin, heard the soft clink of a glass being poured, heard Richard's voice rise to a particular pitch that he reserved for moments when he wanted to make sure he was being overheard. She let them settle for 90 seconds. Then she stood, picked up her cap from the small shelf beside the pilot's seat, settled it carefully on her head, tucked her clipboard under her arm, and stepped out of the cockpit. The cabin of a Gulfstream G700 is not a large space. It is roughly 45 feet from the forward galley to the rear lavatory, lined with 8 cream-colored leather seats arranged in 2 facing pairs, with a small conference table between the forward pair and a small bar service area at the aft. The lighting at that hour of the morning, with the cabin shades half drawn, was warm and gold. Richard was sitting in the second seat on the left side, facing aft, with a tumbler of bourbon already in his right hand. Sterling was directly across from him. Greaves was in the seat behind Sterling, scrolling on a tablet. None of the three men looked up when Amara stepped into the cabin. She did not clear her throat. She did not announce herself. She simply walked to the precise spot in the center aisle where federal aviation regulations required the pilot in command to stand for the pre-flight safety briefing, lifted her clipboard, and began to speak in her clear professional voice. "Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Captain Amara Hayes, and I'll be your pilot in command on this flight to Dallas. First Officer Reyes is up front completing our final checks. Our flight time today will be approximately 3 hours and 22 minutes, with smooth conditions expected at our cruising altitude of 39,000 feet. She paused. Sterling had looked up. Greaves had set down his tablet. Richard had not moved. Before we depart, I'm required to walk you through the standard safety briefing. If you'll direct your attention to the exits, you'll find one forward door, which is the door you entered through, and one emergency exit over the right wing. She extended her arm in the smooth, measured gesture she had performed perhaps 4,000 times across her career. And that was the moment Richard Calloway, without lifting his eyes from his phone, snapped his fingers twice in her direction and said, "Hey, sweetheart, grab me another bourbon. And tell whoever's flying this thing to stop hitting the bumps." The cabin went quiet. Sterling's mouth opened slightly. Greaves looked up from his tablet and looked at Richard and looked at Amara and looked back at Richard with an expression that suggested he had just watched a man step casually off a curb into traffic. Mateo, who had been arranging napkins in the forward galley, froze with his hand still hovering above the linen. Amara did not move. She did not lower her clipboard. She did not adjust her expression. She simply waited, in the small, calm pause she had learned to deploy during her Air Force years, the pause that gave a man one full second to hear what he had just said out loud and reconsider it. Richard did not reconsider it. He looked up, registered that the briefing had stopped, registered that the woman in uniform was still standing in the aisle, and said, with the small, impatient edge of a man who was not accustomed to being made to wait for service, "Did you hear me? Bourbons, and tell the pilot to smooth it out. We haven't even taken off yet, and I can already tell it's going to be a rough ride." Amara lowered her clipboard. She did this slowly, with the deliberate care of a woman who had thought about this exact moment many times across the preceding 6 months, and who had decided that her response, when it came, would be calm and clear and absolutely on the record. She said, "Mr. Calloway, I am the pilot. I'm Captain Hayes. I'm the pilot in command of this aircraft. Mr. Mateo, who is standing in the galley, is your cabin attendant, and he'll be happy to refresh your drink after we complete the safety briefing and reach cruising altitude." There was a beat. Sterling's eyes had moved to Richard's face. Greaves had reached very slowly for his tablet, and Amara would learn later that what he had done was open the voice memo application and begin recording. Richard stared at her for a moment with the kind of expression a man produces when his brain has received information that does not match the categories his brain has prepared. Then his face did something that Amara had seen 17 times across the preceding 6 months, on the faces of 17 different men in 17 different cabins, the small, ugly tightening around the mouth that always preceded the worst thing any of them was about to say. "No," Richard said. "No, you're not the captain. The captain is in the cockpit. You're the flight attendant. I don't know what kind of stunt you're trying to pull with the costume, but I want my actual pilot out here, and I want my bourbon, and I want it now." The cabin was silent. Mateo had not moved. Sterling had set his coffee cup down on the small table between them with a small, careful click. Greaves was looking at the floor. Amara took one slow breath. She turned her head very slightly toward the open cockpit door, raised her voice just enough to carry, and said, "First Officer Reyes, would you step into the cabin for a moment, please?" Daniel Reyes emerged from the cockpit. He was a tall, solidly built man with close-cropped graying hair, 4 gold bars of his own on his shoulders that any aviation professional in the cabin would have recognized as the markings of a senior first officer, and the unmistakable bearing of a former Navy aviator. He stepped into the aisle behind Amara, placed his hands behind his back in a parade rest he had not consciously dropped in 26 years, and waited. Amara said, "Mr. Calloway, this is First Officer Daniel Reyes. He's my second in command on this aircraft. I'm Captain Amara Hayes. I'm the pilot in command. Those are my 4 bars." She tapped the gold on her shoulder once lightly. "Those are his 4 bars," she gestured to Daniel. "Both of us are required to be in the cockpit for takeoff." Richard's face had gone a curious shade of red. "This is ridiculous," Richard said. He had stood up. He was holding the bourbon glass in his right hand, and a small amount of it had sloshed onto the cream-colored leather seat behind him, and he had not noticed. "Sterling, get me Henderson on the phone. This is ridiculous. I am not flying to Dallas with a flight attendant pretending to be the pilot. I want the actual pilot. I want Henderson on the phone. Sterling, are you listening to me?" Jonathan Sterling was listening. Jonathan Sterling had been with Calloway Holdings for 11 years, and Jonathan Sterling had heard Richard speak to a great many people in a great many tones across those 11 years. But Jonathan Sterling had never quite heard Richard say what Richard had just said, in front of Jonathan Sterling, on the record, with a recording device clipped to the lapel of the woman Richard had just refused to recognize. Sterling did not reach for his phone. Sterling looked at Amara. Sterling looked at the 4 gold bars on her shoulder. Sterling looked at the gold wings on her breast pocket. And Sterling, in the quiet, careful voice of a man who had just realized that he was witnessing something that would matter in a boardroom several months in the future, said, "Richard, sit down." Richard did not sit down. "Sterling, are you out of your mind? Did you hear what I just said? I want Henderson. Henderson is my pilot. Henderson has flown me for 6 years. This woman is not Henderson." Amara, still calm, still standing in the precise center of the aisle, said, "Captain Henderson retired from Calloway Holdings 4 months ago, Mr. Calloway. The notification was sent to your office on June 14th. I've been the pilot in command of this aircraft for your past 3 flights, including the round trip to Miami in August and the trip to Chicago in September. I introduced myself to you on each of those flights." This was true. She had introduced herself to him each time. On each occasion, Richard had not looked up from his phone. On each occasion, he had spoken past her to Mateo or to Daniel, or to no one in particular. On each occasion, the small recorder on her lapel had captured every word. Walter's legal counsel had been building a chronological record of those introductions for 4 months. Richard's mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. He looked at Sterling. Sterling did not meet his eyes. He looked at Greaves. Greaves was studying the carpet. He looked back at Amara, and for the first time in the entire exchange, something in his expression flickered, the small private flicker of a man who had just understood, somewhere in the back of his mind, that a door had closed behind him while he had been busy shouting at the person who was holding the key. He recovered with the speed of a man who had spent 25 years recovering from bad moments by escalating them. "Fine," he said. "Fine. You're the pilot. Congratulations. Now get me my bourbon and get this plane in the air, because we have a meeting in Dallas at 1 o'clock, and I am not going to miss it because the pilot of my aircraft wants to play stewardess." Amara did not move. She said very evenly, "Mr. Calloway, I'm going to ask you one time to take your seat and allow me to complete the safety briefing. If you're unable to do that, I'm authorized under federal aviation regulations to remove you from this aircraft prior to departure. I would prefer not to do that. I would prefer to fly you to Dallas. But that decision is going to be yours." There was a long, dense, glassy silence. The cabin had become the kind of room in which every small sound, the soft hum of the auxiliary power unit outside the fuselage, the faint click of Mateo's hand finally lowering from the napkin he had been holding, the small involuntary cough that Greaves produced into his closed fist, became suddenly audible. Richard stood in the aisle holding his bourbon glass with his face the color of a wine label. He looked at Sterling. He looked at Greaves. Neither of them looked back at him. He looked at Daniel Reyes, who had not moved a millimeter from his parade rest position, and whose expression was the carefully neutral expression of a former military aviator who had been told by his captain to stand in the aisle and was prepared to stand there for the rest of the morning if necessary. Richard sat down. He sat down hard. The bourbon sloshed again, and this time he noticed, and he muttered something under his breath that even the recording would not later be able to clean up sufficiently to be quoted in a board document. He set the glass down on the small side table. He folded his arms across his chest. He looked out the window. Amara lifted her clipboard. She said, "Thank you. As I was saying, in the event of an emergency, you'll find one forward door." She completed the safety briefing in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, exactly the length she had completed it on every previous flight. She did not rush. She did not slow down. She did not add anything for emphasis. She walked through the location of the emergency exits, the operation of the oxygen masks, the location of the life vests, the location of the fire extinguishers, and the procedure for opening the forward door in the event of an emergency evacuation. Richard did not look at her once during the entire briefing. Sterling looked at her steadily. Greaves listened with the attentive expression of a man who had decided, somewhere in the past 4 minutes, that paying close attention to Amara Hayes was suddenly the most important professional skill he could exhibit. When she finished, she said, "Thank you, gentlemen. We'll be wheels up in approximately 12 minutes. First Officer Reyes and I will be in the cockpit. Mr. Mateo will be available to you throughout the flight for any cabin service. We'll see you in Dallas." She turned, walked to the cockpit, slid into the left seat, and closed the door behind her with the small, soft click of a latch that had been engineered to close softly. Daniel settled into the right seat. He did not speak for a moment. He ran through the engine start sequence with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed it 11,000 times. Then, as the second engine spooled up and the cabin pressure began its smooth, controlled climb, he said quietly, without looking at her, "Captain." That was the most professional removal of a man's dignity I have ever watched a pilot perform without saying a single unkind word. Amara did not smile. She was watching the engine instruments. She said only, "We have a flight to fly, First Officer." "Yes, ma'am." The flight itself was uneventful in the way that good flights are always uneventful. They departed Teterboro at 9:17 in the morning. They climbed to 39,000 feet on a smooth westerly heading. They cruised across Pennsylvania and Ohio and into the long, flat air over the Mississippi River Valley without encountering more than 3 minutes of light turbulence over central Tennessee. Amara flew the first half. Daniel flew the second. Mateo served the 3 men in the cabin a light breakfast of fruit and pastries and refilled Richard's bourbon glass twice, both times in silence, both times under the steady eye of Greaves, who had quietly switched his recording app to its highest fidelity setting, and who was, by his own later account to investigators, beginning to draft in his head the resignation letter he would deliver to Richard within 48 hours. They landed at Dallas Love Field at 12:41 in the afternoon, 21 minutes ahead of schedule. Amara taxied the aircraft to the executive terminal. She powered down the engines. She completed her final checklist. She stood, smoothed her uniform, picked up her cap, and stepped out of the cockpit one final time to deliver the customary post-flight courtesy to the passengers. The 3 men were already gathered at the forward door, ready to disembark. Sterling was holding his briefcase. Greaves was holding his tablet. Richard was holding his phone, on which he had spent most of the past 3 hours typing furious messages to a series of recipients who had not, by that point, responded to any of them. Amara stood in the aisle and said, in the same calm professional voice she had used at the beginning of the flight, "Thank you, gentlemen. It's been our pleasure to fly you today. We hope you have a productive afternoon in Dallas." Sterling met her eyes. He said very quietly, "Thank you, Captain." Greaves said nothing, but he nodded, a small, precise nod that contained more apology than any words he could have produced in front of his employer. Richard did not look at her. He walked past her down the air stair without speaking, climbed into the waiting town car, and was driven away. Amara watched the car pull away. Then she went back to the cockpit, sat down in the left seat, and spent 90 seconds with her eyes closed. Daniel did not speak. After 90 seconds, she opened her eyes, reached into the locked compartment of her flight bag, removed her phone, and made one call. She made it to Walter Brennan's private legal counsel, a careful 62-year-old woman named Patricia Lau, whose office had been the recipient of every encrypted weekly summary for the preceding 6 months. The call lasted 4 minutes. Amara described the incident in plain, factual language. Patricia listened without interrupting. When Amara finished, Patricia said only, "I have the recording from your lapel device on my server already. I'll have transcripts to Walter within the hour. He's been expecting this call for 6 months. Captain Hayes, you have done extraordinary work. Go get some rest. We'll handle the rest." Amara ended the call. She looked at Daniel. She said, "Let's go find some lunch." What happened over the following 72 hours unfolded with the quiet mechanical efficiency of a process that had been engineered, rehearsed, and held in reserve for 6 months for precisely this moment. By the time Amara and Daniel had finished a quiet lunch at a barbecue place 15 minutes from Dallas Love Field, Patricia Lau had already forwarded the encrypted audio file of the cabin recording, the cockpit voice recording, and the lapel recording to Walter Brennan's personal email. By the time the 3 men had finished their acquisition meeting downtown at 4:30 in the afternoon, Walter had already convened an emergency call with the 4 independent directors on the Calloway Holdings board. By the time Richard returned to his suite at the mansion on Turtle Creek at 7 that evening, Walter had already obtained verbal commitments from all 4 independents to attend a closed-door board session in New York the following Friday morning. And by the time Richard sat down for dinner at the hotel's restaurant, alone because Sterling had quietly declined his invitation, citing a previously undisclosed dinner with a college friend, the formal notice of that board session had been delivered to Richard's office by a courier service that Walter had retained on a permanent monthly basis for exactly this category of delivery. The notice contained 1 paragraph. It informed Richard that the board would be convening on the following Friday morning to discuss matters relating to executive conduct on company aircraft. It informed him that his presence was required. It informed him that legal counsel would be present. It did not name Amara. It did not describe the incident. It did not need to. Richard read the notice 3 times. He called his personal attorney. His personal attorney, a man who had been quietly receiving copies of Patricia Lau's monthly summaries through a confidential channel that Walter had established the previous April, listened to Richard for approximately 11 minutes before suggesting, in the careful voice of a man who had spent the past 4 months preparing for this conversation, that Richard might want to retain separate criminal counsel. Richard did not, at that moment, understand why his personal attorney had used the word criminal. He would understand 4 days later. The board session convened at 9 in the morning on a gray Friday in early November in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a Midtown Manhattan office building. The room was the same conference room in which Walter had originally recruited Amara 6 months earlier. Walter had chosen it deliberately. Present in the room were Walter, the 4 independent directors, Patricia Lau, 2 outside attorneys retained by Patricia's firm, Jonathan Sterling in his capacity as Chief Financial Officer, and Richard Calloway. Amara was not present. Walter had been very clear that her presence was not required and would not be requested. She had done her work. Her work was now in the recordings. The session lasted 4 hours. Patricia walked the board through a chronological summary of 17 prior complaints, beginning with Janelle Robinson's filing 9 years earlier, all of which had been quietly settled through an off-balance sheet discretionary account that Patricia had reconstructed through subpoenaed bank records. She walked them through the past 6 months of documented incidents, every one of them recorded, every one of them transcribed, every one of them cross-referenced against Richard's calendar and travel records. And then, at exactly 11:37 in the morning, she played the recording from the Dallas flight. The recording lasted 6 minutes. The board listened to it in complete silence. Sterling, who was sitting at the far end of the table, looked down at his hands for the entire 6 minutes. When the recording ended, Walter, who was sitting at the head of the table, removed his reading glasses, set them down on the polished walnut surface in front of him, and turned to Richard. "Richard," he said quietly, "I have known you for 15 years. I gave you your first $8 million. I have watched you build something I was proud of for a very long time. And I have spent the past 3 years trying to convince myself that what I was hearing about you was not true. I do not have that option anymore." Richard did not speak. He was looking at the wood grain of the table. The vote was taken at 1:15 in the afternoon. Removal as chief executive, unanimous. Removal from the board of directors, unanimous. Referral of the 17 prior settlements to outside counsel for review of potential securities violations relating to undisclosed material liabilities, unanimous. The board's decision was conveyed to Richard in writing within 90 minutes. His access to corporate accounts was suspended by the end of the business day. His company-issued phone was deactivated. His office was vacated by company personnel over the weekend. And on the following Monday morning, his name was removed from the corporate website with the small surgical efficiency of a process that had been planned weeks in advance. The press release went out at 10 o'clock that Monday morning. The press release was 3 paragraphs long. It announced that Richard Calloway had resigned from his position as Chief Executive Officer of Callaway Holdings effective immediately, that Jonathan Sterling had been appointed interim Chief Executive, and that the board had retained outside counsel to conduct a comprehensive review of historical conduct on company-operated aircraft. It did not name Amara. It did not name Janelle Robinson. It did not describe the Dallas flight. It did not need to. By 11 that morning, the financial press had already begun to make the connections. By noon, an anonymous source inside the legal review had leaked the existence of 17 historical settlements to a senior reporter at a major business publication. By 3 in the afternoon, the headline had moved from the business section to the front page of the national news. By 5, Richard's name was trending across 3 platforms. The story that broke publicly was not the story Amara had documented. The story Amara had documented was a careful, sober legal record. The story that broke publicly was a louder, messier thing, a thing assembled from leaks and reactions and former employees who suddenly, with the protection of public attention, found their voices in a way that the non-disclosure agreements they had signed could no longer entirely silence. Within a week, 4 of the 17 original complainants had retained attorneys to challenge the enforceability of their settlements on the grounds that the underlying conduct had constituted ongoing harm. Within 2 weeks, the Securities and Exchange Commission had opened a preliminary inquiry into the discretionary account through which the settlements had been funded. Within a month, 2 of Richard's largest institutional investors had quietly divested. Within 2 months, Callaway Holdings had announced a restructuring that included the sale of 3 subsidiary businesses, a 15% reduction in corporate overhead, and the establishment of a permanent independent ombudsman office reporting directly to the board's audit committee. The ombudsman office was named, in a small line item buried in the 3rd paragraph of the announcement, the Robinson office. Walter had insisted on the name. He had not consulted Janelle. He had not needed to. Janelle Robinson learned about it on a Tuesday morning in early December, sitting at the small wooden table in the back of the bakery in Jamaica, Queens, where she had worked for the past 9 years. She was reading the business section of the newspaper while she drank her 2nd cup of coffee, and she came across the announcement, and she sat very still for a long moment, and then she called Amara. Amara had told her, 2 weeks earlier over a quiet Sunday dinner at their grandmother's old kitchen table in southeast Queens, the full story of what had happened. Janelle had cried then. She had not cried again until she read the name of the office. Amara had quietly resigned from her position as captain on the Callaway Holdings aircraft 3 days after the board session. Her contract through Walter's Independent Oversight Committee had been structured as a defined 6-month assignment, and the assignment had ended. She had been offered a permanent position as the chief pilot of the newly restructured executive flight operation, reporting directly to Sterling, at a salary that would have made her one of the highest-paid corporate pilots in the country. She had thought about it for 48 hours. She had declined. She had declined because what she actually wanted to do next was something different, something she had been thinking about for several months and had begun to plan in detail during the long evenings of the preceding October. What she wanted to do was build a flight school. Not a hobbyist flight school. A serious, fully accredited, multi-engine and multi-crew certified training operation, headquartered at a small regional airport in southeastern New York, dedicated specifically to recruiting and credentialing aviators from communities that had been historically underrepresented in commercial and corporate aviation. She had been quietly assembling the business plan for 4 months. She had a location identified. She had 2 retired airline captains who had agreed to serve on her instructor board. She had a curriculum drafted in collaboration with a former colleague from the Air Force who now ran a similar program in Southern California. What she did not have when she walked away from Calloway Holdings in early December was the capital. Walter Brennan called her on a Friday afternoon, a week after her resignation. He asked her to come see him at his office on the 42nd floor. He asked her to bring her business plan. She brought it. He read it for 40 minutes in complete silence at the polished walnut table in the conference room, where Amara had first sat down with him 6 months earlier. When he finished, he closed the binder, set his reading glasses down beside it, and said, "Captain Hayes, I would like to be the founding capital partner in this venture. I would like to commit $12 million, structured as a no-interest forgivable loan over 15 years, contingent only on the school maintaining its accreditation and meeting its enrollment targets." Amara, who had prepared herself for any number of responses, had not prepared herself for that one. She said yes. The Hayes Aviation Academy opened its doors 14 months later, on a clear, bright morning in February, at a small regional airport in Orange County, New York. The opening ceremony was small and deliberately unflashy. Walter Brennan attended in a quiet gray suit. Patricia Lau attended. Daniel Reyes, who had agreed 3 months earlier to come on as the Academy's chief flight instructor, attended in his new uniform. Janelle Robinson, who had agreed 2 months earlier to come on as the Academy's director of student affairs, attended in a blazer her grandmother had purchased for her 13 years earlier and that she had kept in the back of her closet, for an occasion she had not, at the time, been able to name. Mateo, who had quietly left Calloway Holdings 4 months after Richard's removal, and who had enrolled himself as the Academy's first commercial pilot student, attended in a borrowed flight suit that did not quite fit him correctly, and that he wore with the pride of a man who had just realized that the rest of his life was going to look different than the life he had previously imagined. The first class of 40 students reported for orientation the following Monday. 28 of them were women. 31 of them were Black, Latino, or Indigenous. All 40 of them had received full scholarships funded by an endowment that Amara had quietly established, using a portion of the settlement she had received from Calloway Holdings following the public revelation of the conduct she had documented. The settlement had been negotiated by Patricia Lau. The amount had not been disclosed. The endowment, however, was a matter of public record. It was called, in its founding documents, the Janelle Robinson Scholarship Fund. Richard Calloway was indicted by a federal grand jury 14 months after his removal from Calloway Holdings on 7 counts relating to securities fraud, wire fraud, and the structuring of payments to conceal material liabilities from the company's investors. The 17 prior complainants, freed from the enforceability of their original non-disclosure agreements by a state court ruling that had relied substantially on the public record Amara's documentation had created, filed a coordinated civil action that resulted in a settlement 2 years later for a sum that consumed the majority of Richard's remaining personal assets. He pleaded guilty to 3 of the 7 federal counts in exchange for a reduced sentence. He served 28 months in a minimum security facility in Pennsylvania. By the time he was released, the aviation industry in which he had once flown anywhere he pleased had moved on so completely that no charter operator in the country would carry him as a passenger without a formal vetting process he was no longer willing to undergo. He returned to a small house in the same Connecticut suburb where his parents had once posted his bail. He did not, the public record suggests, return to any meaningful professional life. Calloway Holdings, under Jonathan Sterling's continuing leadership, had by then become something quietly different. The Robinson office had received and substantiated 41 separate complaints in its first 2 years of operation, most of them involving conduct that predated Richard's removal, but had been silenced by the same off-balance sheet mechanism. Every substantiated complaint had been resolved with a direct apology from the board, a settlement that did not require any non-disclosure provision, and a commitment to publicly report the substantiated finding in the company's annual disclosures. Sterling had told Patricia, in a private conversation early in his tenure as chief executive, that he intended to be the kind of leader his 11 years of silence under Richard had not allowed him to be. He had, by every public measure, kept that commitment. Amara Hayes is, as of the most recent reporting, 41 years old. The Hayes Aviation Academy has graduated 412 pilots across its first 6 years of operation. 63% of those graduates are women. 71% are people of color. 48 of them currently fly for major commercial carriers. 9 of them, including Mateo, currently serve as captains on corporate aircraft, including 3 on the very Gulfstream G700 that Amara once piloted across the long, flat air above Tennessee on a smooth October morning, while the man who had snapped his fingers at her sat in the cabin and did not yet know what was coming. Amara has never given an interview about the Dallas flight. She has been asked many times. She has declined every time. She says only when pressed that the work spoke for itself, and that the work she is doing now is the only work she wants her name attached to. Her grandmother's leather-bound notebook sits on the corner of her desk in the small office at the academy. It is open most mornings to a page near the back, on which Amara wrote one sentence on the night she returned home from Dallas 6 years ago. The sentence reads, "They will always tell you who you are. Be ready when they are wrong." If this story moved you tonight, do me one favor before you scroll away. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below telling us about a moment in your own life when someone underestimated you and what you did about it. We read every single one. And remember, the people who try to shrink you to fit the seat they have assigned you almost always do not know what cockpit you have already been cleared to fly. Keep training. Keep documenting. Keep your name on your wings. We will see you in the next story.